Tomorrow Never Knows welcomes our guests, Jude Southerland Kessler of the John Lennon series, and Lanea Stagg of the Recipe Record series into the Beatles Kingdom tonight. The Fab Two will clue us into the magical mystery motives of John and George in late 68, early 69. These Beatle authors will also keep us up to date on their latest works. Welcome, ladies, to the show.
Hello.
Hello.
Welcome, Lena. Welcome, Jude.
It is good to have you here.
We're delighted to be here always.
We are. Anytime we get a chance to talk Beatles, you know we'll be there.
Darn tootin'. And when we want to talk Beatles, we come to you guys. But we want to read Beatles too. We go to your books. But when we want a magazine format, do you know where we go? We go to Beatles Magazine. Beatles Magazine is a publication with 370 plus million visitors in all their pages, read by thousands of fans around the world every day. Beatles news is updated daily, 24 hours. Audio, video, photos, interviews, contests. You mean you can win things? Additional materials and more. So follow the Beatles Magazine, the most complete online coverage, 24 hours a day. And how many days a week, people?
8 days a week.
I love it. So let's get right into it. Lena, give us a little background information concerning 1968 and early 1969 and George Harrison's life that might give us all a perspective about the songs he was to create for Abbey Road. So what was George doing at that time?
Well, first of all, Bob and Warren, it's wonderful to be on your show. It's always wonderful to talk about George Harrison and to be talking about George with my dear friend, my wonderful friend Jude Kessler. And we love to banter about who's the better Beatle, George or John. So we have done lots of we've done lots of shows on our podcast about John and George, and so we do love to chat about those two.
Your podcast, you say, but we were going to ask you about that later, but now that you brought it up, you have to tell us. Tell us about your podcast, too. What's the name? Where can they find it?
You can find it at Podbean and other places where you find your podcasts, which iTunes, YouTube, Spotify. The name of the show is She Said, She Said, and we offer wonderful guests and lots of great topics about our wonderful Beatles and especially John. So we hope to have some new listeners check us out. But so with that short commercial over, I will talk a little bit about the wonderful George Harrison. So in 1968, there was a lot of time taken up in recording the White Album, producing it and getting it recorded. And unlike many of the Beatles' previous LPs, the White Album saw George playing a significant role, and his offerings of Not Guilty, which didn't make the final cut on the album, of course, but that song took a lot of work, and it had a very strong message. And in fact, in a good way to hammer the message out to his bandmates, he had them record the song many, many times, to a total of 103 times, and they certainly got the message after having played that song, recording that song 103 times. So I think they got the message that he was not guilty. So he also was working on Savoy Truffle and Long, Long, Long in October of 1968, and they were at EMI Studios, which is now fondly known to Beatles fans as Abbey Road Studios. But remember, it was never called Abbey Road back then. Jude Kessler told me that. That nomenclature only began after the Abbey Road album was released. And naturally, he was doing his part on the other recordings that his Beatle comrades were finishing up in early to mid-October of 1968. In mid-October, George came over to the States, to good old Los Angeles, and he was there for 7 weeks, and he was working with Jackie Lomax in the production of Lomax's album for Apple Records, which was entitled, Is This What You Want? And while George was out in Los Angeles, he had an unannounced cameo walk-on an episode of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour TV show, and that actually aired in November 17th of 1968. But while he was in Los Angeles, he was, hanging out with friends, and he was kind of, enjoying a real life as opposed to what he had been doing with the Beatles up to that time. So he also met a really creative man named Bernie Krause, who was an electronics expert. And he introduced George to the Moog synthesizer, which was something that just turned everything upside down. Using this device, George recorded a 25-minute instrumental piece called No Time or Space. That's how I feel every day. But he ended up putting that recording on the shelf until May of 1969 and released it. He released an album of electronic sounds. And so No Time or Space would take up a lot of space on side 2 of that album, which it took up the entire side. But he had a lot of fun in Los Angeles with his friend Donovan, and although what might have seemed unproductive, as John Lennon so keenly observed, time you enjoy wasting was not wasted. So I love that quote. It is always puts things into perspective. But what we see from late 1968 was George was moving steadily into his own projects and being very creative and becoming a solo artist in his own right. And so when 1969 rolls around and the Beatles are still an entity, but they're just hanging on by a thread, Paul comes up with this idea of doing a massive live performance of to be some sort of a concert to be taped and then aired on TV. He is recollecting their early days when they performed live, and that I think Paul cherished those performances, and he thinks that if they can do that again, it'll bring them back to it'll almost kind of quote, they can get back to where they once belonged, is what I'm trying to say.
It's a neat way to put it.
I thought so. of all of the Beatles, George is the least enthusiastic of this group idea. Mark Lewison, the great Mark Lewison, in the complete Beatles Chronicles, says that George, quote, only half-heartedly agreed to the TV performance if it would please the others, quote. In his heart of hearts, he didn't think the live show would solve anything, and as we all know now in retrospect, it certainly did not solve anything. But in fact, they started taping this project at Twickenham Studios just after the holidays, and by the 10th of January, George had had such a blowout with Paul and a bitter argument with John that George stormed out and said, "See you around the clubs," and none of the Beatles tried to stop him. So he spent the next several days recording in his Esher home, and he went back north for a while to see his parents. So the Beatles, minus George, kept right on with their recording project, and with Yoko's presence now, she was making up the fourth Beatle. So 5 days later, on January 15th, George comes back unannounced, and he says if you don't make some changes, I'm quitting the group. So rather begrudgingly, George and the others sit down to hash out their differences, and they took a 5-hour session, and they laid out some ground rules. That's a pretty good way of making therapy work. So one of the rules, the first rule was the Beatles had to give up this notion of a live performance and instead make an album. Number 2, they would use the songs intended for the live TV special and throw in a few extras. And thirdly, they would move the project from Twickenham Studios into Apple Studios. So Mark Lewison tells us, quote, "It was at this point and this point only that the footage shot at Twickenham Studios for the Beatles at Work, as they called it, production, turned instead into the start of a feature film idea to be called Get Back." And that was the name of the album that they were going to be making as well.
But later it sort of became Get Lost. Just kidding, I'm sorry.
And so later on January 22nd, the Beatles began what is known as the Get Back sessions, and much of which later became the Let It Be film. So they are recording at Apple Studios in Savile Row in London, and that brings us up to the songs that we'll be discussing tonight, which from January 22nd to Saturday, February 22nd, the sessions are really the Get Back sessions. And Mark Lewison says on February 22nd that date marks the beginning of the sessions for what later was to become the Abbey Road LP. So it all flows into one. However, at that time, the Beatles were working on these projects. There was no clear break between projects. They were just working on songs and songs that would later find their niche in one project or the other. So that's a little bit of what was going on in George's world at that moment. It was, I can't even imagine what a creative period that had to be in his life, having come off of the craziness of Beatlemania and then actually having some time to really explore music and the new creative, like the Moog synthesizer and things like that were coming out and were piquing his interest. So it was a really creative time for George.
You know, you said there was no break in the recording; they just kept going, and interesting stuff. I just wonder, like, I know that part's not on film. I would like to have seen what it was like, which we won't know because they didn't record it, as far as I know. But where George Martin came back, I just thought that was something interesting. Like in the middle of that, between the Let It Be recordings and the Abbey Road, George Martin slipped back in there at some point. But just a thought. Perhaps another show for us if you guys want to come back later. But
absolutely.
I know that we have a second Beatle lady out there, don't we? Jude. How are you, Jude?
I am great. I'm excited to be talking about John instead of talking about moving. So we're moving for the 33rd time. And so to talk about John Lennon for an hour and get my mind off of moving is a great and happy thing.
Is it a 33rd and a third?
Yeah. Hey, I like that. We have to make it so somehow. I got to think about that.
But what do you do? I know how often you write. Do you have like a pad and pencil? And as you're carrying a table, you put it down and you're jotting notes on John Lennon?
Always.
No.
Yeah, no joke. I really do. Lena gave me the pad and pencil, and I keep it. I'm always borrowing things from people. Like I heard a friend of mine the other day say Dwayne Hicks say he was milling about Walmart, and I said, may I borrow Milling About? And the next day I used it and sent him a copy of where I've dropped it into a chapter. So I'm jotting things down constantly.
Well, that I know. And almost the same question for you, only what was John Lennon doing in late 1968 and early 1969?
Well,
Would you like me to fill out a large question here, or just take that part and I shall ask the next in the next when you're finished with this one?
Go ahead and do the large question.
I'll do the large question, but I wanted to give you the option. I always don't want to just, force it upon you. What was John Lennon doing in late 68 and early 69? And then, if you have your pencil and you can jot it down, Milling About, what outstanding events were taking up the days in the life of our favorite working class hero and rhythm guitarist? Or might we say events that were influencing his mindset, his outlook on the world?
Okay, we'll put that all together into one large answer, and very sadly, it's going to be a very unhappy large answer, because 1968 was probably the second most traumatic year in John's life, the first being 1945, when his parents, for very complicated reasons, surrendered him to live at his Aunt and Uncle's home at 251 Menlove Avenue, the home known as Mendips. I think that was the most traumatic year. And then the second most was 1968, because of many, many things. The first thing was, in modern time, guys, we are taught to believe that John loved only one woman, and that woman was Yoko Ono, and nothing could be further from the truth. John absolutely adored May Pang, and he loved deeply Cynthia Powell Lennon. He fell in love with Cynthia in May of 1958 at the end of term dash at Liverpool College of Art. And they dated from 58 until 62, when they got married in August of 1962. And yes, Cynthia was pregnant when they got married, but John certainly did not have to marry her. It was not something she required or anyone else required. The minute she told him they were expecting a baby, he proposed to her immediately, right on the spot. And, I can give you 1,000 examples of how much John loved Cynthia, but let's just do two for the sake of time reference in the show. But in January of 1964, the Beatles go to Paris to perform there for 3 weeks, and the Beatles are given 1 day off during their 3 weeks in Paris. Paul, George, and Ringo used that 1 day to tour all of the different sites of the city, and to go to Versailles and the Louvre and to do all that sort of stuff. John gets on a plane and flies home to spend the night with his wife. You don't do that unless you're in love with that girl. You don't do that. You go see the sights. Similarly, the next end of February, he is given the opportunity to go to America from February the 7th to the 22nd on this whirlwind tour of America, to be on Ed Sullivan, play at Carnegie Hall, go to Miami, and so forth. And Brian tells him, the one thing that you cannot do is take your wife with you. That hinders your popularity. And John says, she has been with me since day one. I wouldn't even be a Beatle if it wasn't for her. She's going with me to America. And he takes Cynthia with him. And I can give you tons of other examples, including the fact that he calls her every single night on the North American tour. I have witnesses: Art Schreiber, Ivor Davis, Larry Kane. All of them saw him make time every night to call his wife. He loved her. Now we get to 1968, and their marriage, which has been on the slide since 1965, due to John's use of drugs. That's the main thing, is that he's using drugs and she's not. And it's separating them every day. It's pulling them apart. And they finally have reached just about the end of the road. And he has been pursued since 1967 by a very strong-willed avant-garde artist named Yoko Ono. She's been there at almost every function that John goes to. She follows him. She's waiting for him when he comes out of buildings. She writes to him daily. She sends him postcards. She sends him gifts. Even when he's in Rishikesh, she's writing to him, think of me, look at the sky and think of me. And she's been pursuing him for quite a while. And So during the time that his wife is away on a trip, he invites Yoko. He's tempted, and he invites her to come out to his house at Kenwood, and they make music together all night, and then they sleep together at dawn as the sun is rising. Well, most people don't know and don't want to know, because of this pervading myth that Yoko is the only woman that John loved. Most people don't realize that he didn't divorce Cynthia the next day. That wasn't the end of the story. He tells Cynthia the next day, look, that meant nothing to me. It was just sex. And he asks Cynthia if they can put their marriage back together and if she will have another baby with him in order to save their marriage. She says to him, John, that's not what is causing our problems. It's not having another baby. It's the alcohol and the drugs. And you'd be better off with someone like Yoko Ono, quote unquote. So over the next month, they struggle to put their marriage back together, and finally they separate. And he indeed does end up divorcing Cynthia and going to live with Yoko Ono. But Paul McCartney has several quotes, which you can find in the anthology and other sources, in Philip Norman and Mark Lewison, in which Paul says that this was a very dark and depressing time for John. And John says he was so depressed that he thought about committing suicide. In fact, when he writes that song, Your Blues, and everybody says, oh, it's just a parody on the blues theme, or it's just John exploring the blues genre. Well, look, people, the genre didn't pick John Lennon. John Lennon picked the genre because he's depressed and sad, and his heart is breaking. And when he sings, I'm lonely, want to die, you know, he's telling you how he feels. He was extremely depressed about this. Now, in the fall of '68, you know, they file for divorce. He and Cynthia are separated. He's living with Yoko. At first, they live in Kenwood, and then John feels really, 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 really bad that he has taken the home away from his wife and his son. And so he gives Kenwood back to them, and he and Yoko sort of live out of suitcases in various friends' homes. And they're going through that period of adjustment that people have during that first year that they're together, living together. You know, they say the first year of marriage is always the worst. Well, they're going through this struggle, and they have some big issues. It's definitely not the happily ever after that John thought it was going to be. First of all, Yoko tells him, look, I don't know what you think you're doing with all these dirty clothes everywhere, and your dirty socks, and your guitars everywhere, and your pieces of rumpled paper that you're writing songs on, and your food and all this, but you're going to clean it up. And John says, yeah, well, I'm a northern man, and I'm used to women waiting on me. And she says, well, if you think that I'm going to wait on you, a university honors graduate, a respected avant-garde artist, a person who is an individual in her own right, your aunt may have waited on you, and your last wife may have waited on you. But if you think I'm going to wait on you, there's only one solution. I'll leave. And man, that does it. John realizes he's about to lose her, and he panics big time. He not only straightens up his act and quits trying to boss her around and tell her what to do, but he takes her with him everywhere he goes because he's terrified that he's going to lose her. So everywhere John goes, he makes sure she goes, even into the bathroom. He is keeping her by his side nonstop. So this is still a period of adjustment for John. It's not what he thought it was going to be. In October of '68, Yoko was in the studio with him. They're in EMI. He's working on Glass Onion. He's working on Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except Me and My Monkey, which is not about drugs. It's about his relationship. He says this. It's a song about Yoko and me. And he's trying to get people to come on, come on, come on, come on, except Yoko. If you go back and listen to the song. Then on the 13th of October, which is very rare for the Beatles to be recording on a Sunday, they have to do what is going to be the last major recording for the White Album, and it's John's song, and he won't sing it without his friends with him, even though it's a solo. So they go into a very tiny, almost a closet. John has his acoustic guitar, and he begins to sing with his friends right next to him. what will be the mission statement of his life, the song about why he does what he does and why he writes this music and why he sings this music. He records the song Julia, which tells you who he really is. And that really is the end of the major work on the White Album, because the next day Ringo flies away for 2 weeks on holiday. They're really done with the major recordings. John works a little bit more on Sexy Sadie and What's the New Mary Jane. And then on the 15th, he kind of tweaks I'm So Tired and Happiness is a Warm Gun and Cry Baby Cry. But essentially, the White Album is completed and just about ready to roll. And it's going to come out on the 22nd of November, 68. But before we have that wonderful celebration, and before we talk about how much John dominated the White Album, we're jumping the gun, because first we have to walk through November, which is probably one of, if not the worst, the second worst month of John's life. It's brutal. On the 18th of October, John and Yoko, who had been staying in Ringo's flat at 34 Montague Square, get a warning that they are going to be searched for drugs. Now, this isn't John's place. It isn't Yoko's place. And they don't know where drugs are, but they search the house high and low and they remove everything that they can find. The next morning, they're asleep. They're not dressed. There's a pounding on the door. John goes to the door, doesn't have all of his clothes on, and the police barge in and begin tearing everything apart. And because they don't know all the hiding places to look, the police do find 219 grams of cannabis resin. It's not John's and it's not Yoko's. And then they try to arrest John and Yoko, and John resists because his wife is not dressed, or his girlfriend, Yoko, is not dressed. He's not dressed. They try to put clothes on, and so they're charged with resisting arrest and taken to be booked into prison. The next day, they appear before the court. They're remanded on bail. But by this point, John's furious, Yoko's upset, and the press, who hates Yoko and has quickly turned on John, are putting nothing in the papers but how John has fallen from grace and how he's crazy and they're both nuts and they're on drugs and it's not a good scene. Well, 9 days later, Cynthia's divorce is officially listed by the courts. And although John has been saying that he's over it and he's happy and he's moving on, he is destroyed about this filing for divorce. He is in grief and he has deep regret over losing his first wife. And then just a few days after that, Yoko, who's still majorly stressed out about not only about being arrested and having to spend the night in prison, but she's very upset about the fact that the newspapers are against her. She begins to miscarry John's baby that she's expecting, and she's rushed to Queen Charlotte Hospital. And she and John are going to live there in that hospital for the next 14 days. At first, he has a hospital bed and he is sleeping next to her and recording his baby's heartbeat as his child is slowly dying. On the 8th of November, right after Yoko goes into the hospital, Cynthia's divorce is final. She wins full custody of Julian. And on that same day, John is told that he's going to have to relinquish his hospital bed and he needs to go home and not sleep every night with Yoko. And he says, I refuse. You can have the hospital bed, but I'm going to sleep on the floor of the hospital next to my wife. And so from the 8th of November until the 21st of November, John sleeps on the floor next to Yoko, recording that sound of his baby dying. And finally, on 21 November, John Ono Lennon II does die. And they have a private ceremony for him a few days later. What else can happen to someone in 1 month? I mean, it's bad. It's really bad. And I won't say that John and Yoko did nothing. They did all they could to keep their heads up and to do things and to keep their minds off of the tragedies they'd experienced. They pay for a newspaper advertisement to support one of the pirate radio stations that's off the coast of England, the Peace Ship. So they support them. On the 11th of December, they participate in the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus, which is just loaded with stars. Eric Clapton is there, Marianne Faithfull, and The Who. And John comes dressed as a juggler, and that's what he's been doing, all right, is juggling this tragedy, which is his life. And Yoko comes dressed as a witch. And So they put Kenwood up for sale. They decide they need a home of their own. And on the 18th of December, they do the first of Yoko's many happenings. They appear at the Royal Albert Hall inside a white bag at a Christmas gathering called the Underground Christmas Party. But the one thing that they don't do is have much connection with the Beatles. They're really not talking to the other Beatles. And, you know, I can see that the other Beatles were busy too. I mean, Ringo has had to move out of Sunny Heights in Weybridge. He and Maureen are moving to a new house. George, of course, is in America. And Paul and Linda go to Paris for a few days. So everybody's busy, but they do all reconvene just a few days before Christmas when they have the Apple Christmas party, where John and Yoko show up dressed as Father and Mother Christmas in their sort of Santa Claus costumes. And I think that's the first time they all kind of get together and talk, is at that Christmas party. But come January, John is there for the bits that Lena just told you about. They're starting the recording of that live show, which they think they may call the Beatles at Work. They're not quite sure. It morphs into the Get Back sessions. It morphs into Abbey Road and into Let It Be. But John's there. He's not in great form. I mean, he and George had this big blowout, and George has always been his little brother. So for him to fight with George, things have to be bad. He knows that 1969 is going to be rough, but compared to 1968, it's got to be better. I mean, in 68, he lost his first wife. He lost his son, Julian. He almost lost his new love. He lost his baby, John Ono Lennon Jr. He lost his leadership of the Beatles to Paul. Paul has surged to the fore. It's Paul's idea that they're doing this live performance recording. And as the Irish would say, he's lost the run of himself. And he almost lost his life. He seriously considered committing suicide. So that's where we are as we begin considering the songs that John's going to pen in 1969. He was not in a positive frame of mind, as it were.
So, Jude, with that in mind, John began 1969 really traumatized, but hoping the new year would be better. The Beatles begin the Get Back sessions, as they were called, and that feeds into Abbey Road. So along the way, John pens Give Peace a Chance. How did the song Give Peace a Chance come about? I know it was credited to both Lennon and McCartney. Tell us about that. And what was on the mind of John as he wrote and recorded this one? I know there was a big hoopla with the, different things going on, where they recorded it and such.
Okay. Well, I was really honored about a year or so ago to be asked by Bruce Spicer, whom I consider to be one of the greats in the Beatles world, to write a chapter about John's songs during this era for a book that he was writing at that time called The Beatles Get Back to Abbey Road. And a little bit of what we're going to talk about is just a tiny portion of what I put into that book. So if you want to read more about it, you can always get Bruce's book, which is The Beatles Get Back to Abbey Road at Beatle.net. We'll kind of just hit the high points, and then the rest of the stuff you can explore in that book. But I don't know if people have seen the movie Family Man, the big Christmas classic Family Man. But in it, the protagonist is given what they call a glimpse. And a glimpse is defined as a temporary look into the future. And that's what Give Peace a Chance is. In this one song, you get to glimpse what John Lennon is going to be like in the 1970s. In 4 minutes and 54 seconds, you get this look at who is to come. John Lennon 2.0, the performance artist that he's going to be, the solo star. And he is going to emerge as a peace activist who writes important historical jingles. Jingles, earworms, phrases that stick in people's heads, that they will remember, that they'll embed in their memory, and then they will act on. What he does in this song and in others that we'll talk about is he creates a melodic slogan that burrows its way into the listener's brain. And once you've heard it, you can't unhear it. You can't forget it. It's there to stay. Well, this one was actually inspired during his wedding celebration. You know, he was married in Gibraltar, and then after he was married, he and Yoko had their honeymoon at the Amsterdam Hilton. They were using that as a happening, an activist movement for peace. And it got attention and it was in the newspapers and all of that, but it didn't get the impact that John really wanted to spur people on to call for peace, specifically against the Vietnam War, but generally against war as a whole. Well, about 6 months later, this Bed In for Peace the concept is resurrected. They decide to fly to Canada, to Montreal, and to do the same thing again. But this time they're going to invite in a lot of celebrities and friends, and they're going to bring these people there to their hotel in Montreal, give interviews, talk to journalists, really campaign for peace. So a lot of people show up. Dear friends, people that they like, such as Derek Taylor, who had been the Beatles press agent in 1964. He and Brian had a gigantic blowout on the North American tour, and Derek quit. But the Beatles keep in touch with Derek because he goes to work for KRLA in Los Angeles, and he interviews them when they're making help in the Bahamas. Murray the K, who called himself the fifth Beatle, the New York disc jockey, is invited up. Alex Ginsberg is there. Petula Clark, who is the recording star from Britain that they were friends with during the early years of the British invasion. Dick Gregory, Timothy Leary is there, and he's crucial to this story. Tommy Smothers, one of the Smothers brothers. There are lots of reporters there, and the Hare Krishna faithful have gathered as well. And so John and Yoko say, you know, we're gonna participate in singing songs. They hand out instruments for people to play. There are tambourines that are handed out, and you have these trained voices like Petula Clark's. She's singing, and Tommy Smothers is singing, and the Smothers brothers frequently sang songs on their TV show. And then you have untrained voices, and they're all going to sing together. So this Montreal Bed-In ends up doing what the Amsterdam event never could accomplish, and that is it sires this very powerful peace ballad, this song that's going to speak out to the world against Vietnam, not against the soldiers. John was never against the soldiers who participated. He was against the war in Vietnam and against all wars in general. And it is so successful. This song is so well done and so powerful. It was originally planned as a ballad for Timothy Leary to use during his campaign to become governor of California. Unfortunately, he's arrested on drug charges and can't run for governor. The song is lying there fallow, and John picks it up, runs with it, and it becomes the Give Peace a Chance that on the 15th of November, 1969, becomes the anthem that is sung at the Vietnam moratorium in Washington, D.C., and thousands of people pick it up because it's easy to memorize, easy to understand and sing, and they sing it there that day at the Vietnam moratorium. Well, John decides to credit the song, which is not backed by the Beatles. It's backed by the Plastic Ono Band, and if you ask your playing device, Alexa, to play the song for you, she will tell you that this is a song not by John Lennon, but by the Plastic Ono Band. So Paul has no hand in this song at all, but he has done something really gracious for John. When John wanted to record the Ballad of John and Yoko, Paul went into studio with him and helped him record the Ballad of John and Yoko and did it as one friend to another. So John's payback is he credits this song to Lennon and McCartney. What it really is the premier song of John's new solo career. It is his first night. This song thrust him full bore into who he's going to be in the 1970s. No longer is he the suit-wearing, bow-at-the-waist, very polite little Beatle that Brian Epstein dreamed up. This is John Lennon of this upcoming decade, his first musical happening. Now, Yoko has had him do that bag-in thing that he did back in December where he's sitting in the Royal Albert Hall in a bag. It's not very successful. They plant acorns for peace. Semi-successful, but this song, John Lennon's bid for peace, highly successful. So successful that it not only gives John credibility, it gives Yoko credibility. No longer do people think of them as two gurus in drag. The world begins to pivot to them and look to them for guidance in its search for peace. John's going to follow this with many other political ballads during the 1970s. Power to the People, John Sinclair, Luck of the Irish, Sunday Bloody Sunday, Woman is the End of the World, and Instant Karma. Great, 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 powerful songs. We took a little break and we were talking about, Bob, your preference for John's work with the Beatles as opposed to his solo work. I am a huge proponent of John Lennon, the solo artist. I much prefer him to his songs with the Beatles. If I ask my listening device to play songs for me, I always ask her to play John Lennon. Love his solo work. And this is the debut for his solo work. It establishes his newfound role in the world in room 1742 of Montreal's La Hotel Reine Elizabeth. This lead Beatle transforms himself from a Beatle into John Ono Lennon, large and in charge, the radical voice of the 1970s.
So, Jude, another of John's great songs of that era was Across the Universe. Obviously, it's written under similar circumstances, but despite John's dark mood at the beginning of '69, he's come to a place where he can compose again and write some beautiful music lyrics, hasn't he? Tell us about Across the Universe.
Well, it is. It is a gorgeous song, and it's one of the very few songs that I know of that can stand as a poem without the music. I used to teach poetry at Troy State in Alabama, and I used to tell my students that most songs are cripple poems that really lean on the strength of melody and harmony, on the instrumentation for strength. But just once in a while, a song comes along, and Lanea, you can probably think of one more current than the examples I'm going to give. I really tried to think. I think some of the work of Eminem would be poetry that did not really need music to lean on, and maybe you can think of some others, but I'm thinking about Simon and Garfunkel's I Am a Rock. That is a winter's day in a deep and dark December. I'm alone. And it's a beautiful poem if you don't have the music. Sound of Silence, another gorgeous poem without the music. And my favorite song, it's the most beautiful love poem ever written, is the Four Tops Bernadette. You don't need the music, you just read it. And definitely John Lennon pens a poem here it's not to be forgotten. Can you think of one, Lanea, that does that in modern music?
Oddly enough, a song from the 70s that I feel like has rather a kind of edgy poetic prose would be Layla.
Yes.
And I just, the music intensifies it, but even though I don't know that Eric Clapton's much of a poet, I feel like that song was, really poetic.
Yeah. Well, be thinking if you can think of some others too, like in the 90s or 2000s. I've been trying to rack my brain, but this song is definitely one that it stands on its own without the music. And so let's think about what John's talking about here. His lyrics are amazing. He tells us that the song was written after he and Cynthia, during the waning years of their marriage, had this big knockdown, drag out fight right before they went to bed. And he says she was really angry with him, which just makes me really happy to think about the fact that Cynthia was bold enough to give him a piece of her mind, because very often she wasn't. She let him kind of push her around, but she obviously was mad, and she had really told him off, and then she'd gone to sleep. And he says, in my best John Lennon voice, I was lying next to her in bed, and I was irritated. She must have been going on and on about something, and then she'd gone to sleep. And I kept hearing these words over and over, flowing like an endless stream. I went downstairs and I turned it into sort of a cosmic song rather than an irritated song. So something magical happened that night. And what happened was John goes downstairs. He begins to write, And he begins with this beautiful image. And if you guys are listening on the podcast, just close your eyes and listen to these words. Words are flowing out like endless rain into a paper cup. I mean, think about that image. It's a brilliant invocation of this virtual downpour of words into a tiny, impossible receptacle. And as the words begin to hit, you see them start splashing out of this paper cup and dancing across the concrete, dancing across the pavement. And you're watching them as they begin to make their way across the universe. That line is so powerful. It always reminds me of a poem by one of the greatest poets of America, Carl Sandburg. In the 1960s, he wrote this poem called Primer Lesson, and it talks about the autonomy of words and how you can't control words. They control themselves. How once spoken words are so independent and headstrong that they just walk off, refusing to be called back. And that's exactly what John is portraying here. Words making their way without you, slithering across the universe. It's a lovely image, but it's a frightening image depending on what you've said. If you've said something encouraging or kind or good, then your words making their way without you is great. But if you've thoughtlessly said something negative or cruel or wounding, then the image of those words slithering away wildly like venomous snakes is pretty awful. John says that in just a few words. He has a great economy of verbiage. It is extremely powerful. Also, when he says thoughts meander like restless wind inside a letterbox, man, you can hear it, you can see it. He takes you there. Instantly, you think about all those long sleepless nights when you worry and you toss and you turn and you revisit an argument you've had with someone, what you should have said or what you meant to say or what you did say that you're sorry that you said. Those wrong words, those unsaid words, they rattle and they rumble inside what appears to be a hollow metal old school type letterbox, shaking and jarring and tumbling blindly. Another great line that John writes, tumbling blindly as you try to go to sleep and you try to find peace. This image is so artistic, so apt. It's one of the best lines that John ever penned. He reminds us here, he's not just some commercial pop songwriter. He is a poet, the author of 2 literary award-winning books, and he's here to prove it. That night, he put his pen to paper and he wanted to express his emotions about this endless struggle that he and Cynthia were enduring in 1968. And he began to hear a phrase in his head. Now, many biographers have falsely claimed that John learned this phrase in Rishikesh in India when he went to the Maharishi's ashram. Paul said that he took it from the Maharishi, but that is bogus. John began recording. He had written it, polished it, honed it, and began recording across the universe on the 4th of February, 1968. And the Beatles don't even leave to go to Rishikesh until the 19th of February. So John wrote this song and began to record it 15 days before even going to India. Now, John was always one to quote great literature. He was a voracious reader. He read 2 to 3 newspapers a day. By the time he was 8 years old, he had read the collected works of Balzac, something that most adults haven't done. He constantly was quoting obscure theology and obscure literature. For example, in Nobody Told Me There'd Be Days Like This, he has a line, there's a little yellow idol to the north of Kathmandu. It's not John's line. He's quoting J. Milton Hayes. And in his song Woman, he opens by saying, "You're the other half of the sky," which is a line that many great Chinese writers and politicians all claim that they penned. Even his most famous quotation of all, which is, "Life is what happens while you're busy making other plans," was not originally said by John. It was said by a cartoonist named Alan Saunders in 1957. John's quoting. And here in this room, in the dark of night, where he's struggling with his pain over his marriage that's dissolving, he has given the phrase Jai Guru Deva Om, which is Sanskrit, and it means victory to God divine. But what's important here is not John's source or whether or not he's being original. What's important here is what this phrase tells you about what can happen to you when harmful words try to wound you. Without backing any theology or espousing any belief system, without promoting any earthly sect or leader, John Lennon is saying that above our meandering thoughts, which tumble blindly, and our endless words that we hear in the dark of night, God presides, offering us, and these are his words, undying love that shines around us like a million suns, on and on across the universe. John's telling us that, look, guys, in the dark of night, when we're struggling and fretting and we've quarreled and we've had problems with people we love, God's there. He's overseeing our shades of life, and he's offering us something clearer and something better. And what John heard that very mystical night was so beautiful and so holy and precious, but he could never, ever reproduce it on tape. When he tried to record it in the studio and to recapture what he had heard that night, he got really mad. He was aggravated that he couldn't recapture it. He said that Paul was rushing the production of the song in the studio. He even said that Paul tried to sabotage the song. But in 1970, he has Phil Spector try to rework the song for part of Let It Be, and still John never could recapture the sublime sound of the spheres that he heard that night when he wrote this song. I was very, very fortunate to be able to talk with Jeff Emmerich in 2016 and to sit down with him because he was there for the recording of the song. And he told me that John had felt so strongly about Across the Universe, but, and these are his words, he could never find a way to translate the heavenly sound onto an LP. He said John put so much feeling into the song, his vocal was so incredible, but the recorded version of Across the Universe fell short of what John was trying to express. And he always, Jeff said, considered it a failure. Man, makes you wonder, what would the perfect version of this song have been like? Well, I can say, and I'm sure that you guys will get it when I say, I can only imagine. And that explains it all.
So, Lena, this is my first time speaking to you, and I'm happy to do so. My wife was on the show we had last with you and Jude, and she told me she enjoyed it very much, and I thank you for that.
Well, I had a lovely time with her. We had a blast. I think we actually could do a couple-hour show together. No offense, Warren, but I'm delighted to.
No, I know she's much better than I am, and she's more quick-witted than I am. So yeah, I can imagine you guys doing the show together. And I did ask her if she wanted to be on to say anything tonight, but she had to get up early, so she declined. But she told me to tell you guys hi anyway.
Yeah, give her our best. We love her.
All right, I thank you very much for that. So George is also extremely creative in this period. He worked on the music for the film Wonderwall, and he worked with Jackie Lax on his first LP, as you told us earlier. And George enters 1969 and is coming into his own. And one of the songs that he writes in 1969 really expresses his feelings about how his story is behind the Beatles, I Mean Mine. Can you tell us a bit about that powerful song, if you don't mind?
Absolutely, Warren. You know, George, as Jude had mentioned earlier, George was the little brother, and he was often overlooked. And what that drove him to do was to work hard and to learn as much as he could and to create all kinds of music. He was exploring all kinds of different sounds and different instruments, and he was using this period to really do a lot of exploring musically. And with the song I Me Mine, it has a folksy blues sound, and at this time in January of 1969 was when he was composing this song. His discontent, as we'd mentioned earlier, was simmering on high heat with the band. And so this concept of I, me, mine is not a concept that is lost on us. This song had so much significance in George's life that he named his autobiography after the song as well. And this phrase is inspired by Indian teachings where he denounces selfishness. So on a daily basis, George was witnessing ego by John and Paul and others as well. And he found the ego of that's mine, give it to me, as a very shallow existence. And he was looking for truth. And I think we can all commiserate with him in what he was searching for, especially at that time, having gone through what he had gone through with Beatlemania. In the Beatles anthology, George is quoted as saying, I, me, mine is the ego problem. There are two I's. The little I is when people say, I am this. And the big I is duality and ego. There is nothing that isn't part of the complete whole. When the little I merges into the big I, then you are really smiling. So that was George's quote, and every time I read that quote, it makes me smile. But in the Gita, a 700-verse Sanskrit scripture that is part of the Hindu epic Mahabharata, I don't know how to pronounce that.
You did better than me.
It says, I get to read these quotes, so they are, doesn't mean I can always pronounce them. They are forever free who renounce all selfish desires and break away from the ego cage of I, me, and mine to be united with the Lord. This is the supreme state. Attain to this and pass from death to immortality. End quote. So George was criticizing his bandmates, John and Paul, of their egos. And we witnessed George's even louder voice as a lyrical philosopher in this song. And he had begun voicing his opinion during the White Album, especially the criminally omitted song, Not Guilty. And his voice was increasing in strength. We also know that his continuing lyrical philosophy formed stronger ideals, such as, eventually, we know that these came, all things must pass, isn't it a pity, what is life? So George right now is progressing in mind, body, and spirit. We're just witnessing him get into this. In George's autobiography, I, Me, Mine, he stated, quote, to write a song then, even one like Don't Bother Me, helps to rid of some subconscious burden. Writing a song is like going to confession. That was also the result of the LSD, really, but writing songs to try and find out, to see who you are. I was only letting out agony. I have also been grumpy at times because there are a lot of things we had to do collectively that didn't grab me personally during the Beatle days. There was never anything in any of the Beatle experiences really that were that good. Even the best thrills soon got tiring. You don't really laugh twice at the same joke, do you? Unless you really get silly. And when you suffer, it makes you grumpy. So I thought that was a very powerful quote from George and very telling of what he was witnessing. So I Me Mine musically consists of two movements, the somber, waltzy, all through the day, I Me Mine, and then it goes into a very Beatlesque, up-tempo, almost a chant. Me, mine, which I was doing that earlier when we were on Echo. It is a song that has significant philosophy as well as instrumental creativity. You know, Jude absolutely is the foremost authority on John, and she is so right that he had that gift of jingle, and that jingle that everyone still quotes John Lennon, and probably a lot of the kids these days really don't know who he was. But George he had the gift of authenticity, of being genuine almost to a fault at times, but he was really Father Earth. So I don't know if we're going to play these songs, but if you do not have these songs on the show, I encourage everyone to be sure and take a listen to all of these.
I agree. Very good song for sure, and good explanation. Some things that I didn't think about, and George's quotes were right on the money, I believe. Another George tune at this time is For You Blue, and one of my favorites. What is the backstory on that one?
Well, I have always loved this song too, and it was written and recorded initially in January of 1969, but it was reworked a year later and put onto the B-side of The Long and Winding Road, which was of course, in 1970. And I suppose it was loved by many because it was included as a backside. But George reportedly, and this is the backstory that I could find. George reportedly wrote this song for his wife Patty. And oddly, in a 1987 interview, and I want to say it was an interview with Playboy, but I'm not positive. George did not remember the song initially, and then he said it was a Paul song. So over the years, I've read a lot of speculation that this song was actually written by George as an ode to his guitar. And George, I did read that George wrote this song in a matter of minutes, pulling from the time he spent in the Catskill Mountains with the members of the band and Bob Dylan. So the song is a playful song, and you can hear the Beatles really having a good time on the song, you know, in the musical sense of it. Once again, George says in his autobiography that this is a simple 12-bar song following the normal 12-bar principles, except it's happy-go-lucky. So I must concur with George on that end. It is a happy-go-lucky, and it's a rather sweet song about his girl because, and you know, the lyric is, because you're sweet and lovely girl, I love you. So that lyric aside is enough to capture the hearts of all the girls. The music, though, is very striking because you hear John playing the lap slide guitar, which I don't think it happened a lot. Mm-hmm. And George recognizes Chuck Berry and John by saying, "Go, Johnny, go." And delightfully later, he mentions Elmore James. He says, Elmore James got nothing on this baby, which is a tribute to the great blues artist. But the blending of Paul's piano, John's lap steel guitar, and George's acoustic make this just a sweet, enjoyable song. And I think it's perhaps one of the strongest on Let It Be. And from an instrumental perspective, the most bluesy song that the Beatles ever recorded is this song, in a true sense of a 12-bar blues song. So it's beautifully captured here, and I would love to invite people to watch the video of this performance of For You Blue in the concert for George. It's a brilliant performance, but it still pales in comparison to the Beatles' performance of this on Let It Be.
Right.
I think I don't know if I mentioned earlier, I was going on and on about George not remembering the song, but there's reports in addition to George. I had read that George wrote this about his blues guitar. Most reports are that he wrote it for Patty.
Right.
But
Right. Yeah, I agree. And this is a beautiful tune and fantastic for sure. And I do sing this to my wife once in a while, and
oh,
she smiles, and it's just something I do with my wife.
Keep on doing that, Warren.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
You'll have a happy life.
I do have a happy life, and I have a happy wife, and she makes my life complete, that's for sure. And I thank you for that. So George has really come a long way from Don't Bother Me to I Me Mine, hasn't he?
Yes, he really has. He grew up, and
Yes.
and he was almost kind of cynical about it.
Right.
But it was a great perspective.
Yes, it is. And do you feel that his songs stand up to the rest of the band's work in later years?
Well, I feel like George's best work was in the later years. Something, well, While My Guitar Gently Weeps. I mean, those two alone are highly regarded, sometimes regarded as the best Beatles songs. So it depends on if you're asking Jude or Lena. But
Right.
but I would have to say that one of my most favorite George songs from that period would have to be Not Guilty. And I didn't even, run across that song until the past couple of years when the White Album was remastered and it came out with the addition of the Esher demos.
Mhm.
And the acoustic Not Guilty version was on there, and it is mesmerizing. It is such a powerful song, and he, with the acoustic music, his lyrics they just throw, he is throwing those guys down and saying, this is what is going on, and you're not going to blame me for being miserable or any of that. Now, the song was not put onto the White Album, which is the biggest crime in the Beatles years, but it was put onto the anthology later on, and I'm not particularly fond of that version. I prefer the Esher demo version, and I'm not sure if your listening devices can pick that up, but I'm sure it's out there on YouTube, so I would encourage your listeners to take that one in. But it is a perfect reflection of what George was experiencing and how he felt about everybody, and I think everybody has felt like that, whether it's at work, at home, at church, you have felt this way in your life about some people that you've been around. And so I think that's why it resonates so much for fans.
Right. I thank you for answering that, because that was going to be my second part of that question, and thank you for answering that for me. So we are so honored to have you on the show again, even though this is my first time speaking with you. I listened to the show you had before, and it was off the charts, and I really enjoyed listening to it. And when you talked about the last time about the fact that your book is not just a recipe book, it's a music book with great stories and about bands and groups of the 60s to today. Would you mind sharing one of those with us tonight? We love to hear in the Recipe Record series.
Oh, of course, Warren. And it has been a delight to get the opportunity to chat with you. I love talking to Bob too, but I think it's been a great time to chat with you, Warren, and I really appreciate it. So I was trying to think of a good excerpt from one of my books, and I think there's too many to choose from, honestly. But I'm being a little bit smarty pants. But since this is a Beatles show, I thought I would talk a little bit about the Beatles, my Beatles cookbook. And what I did was the recipes are named after songs and things to do with the Beatles, and I have little narratives that are included along in the pages with, different recipes. And so what I tried to do with those narratives was bring a little more information about the Beatles to the fair weather Beatles fan, to somebody who didn't know as much. If people listening to your show, I am not going to be able to provide them with anything that they don't already know. But everyone that I know, that I work with, or everyone in my normal life, nobody knows anything about the Beatles. And so they're delighted to read these little narrations and say, oh yeah, I didn't know that song was about that. And that's what the audience I was trying to reach. So for instance, I have a short description with a recipe called I Relish Her Majesty. And so I wrote a little narration about how that was a hidden track, and talked a little bit about the story behind that song being a hidden track. But I did want to read one thing out of my Beatles cookbook, and I had a lot of people contribute recipes. Jude was one, and so her recipe is pretty awesome. It's strawberry pie forever. And but I had a great person write the foreword for my cookbook, for my Beatles cookbook. His name is Andy Forgy, and he's the lead singer of a Beatles tribute band from I think they're in Montreal or Toronto, one or the other. But they play at Abbey Road on the River in Louisville, Kentucky every year. I've heard thousands of Beatles tribute bands, and this band's my favorite by far. They're just top notch, and they're called All You Need Is Love. So their lead singer wrote the foreword for my cookbook, and I wanted to read his foreword to you, and I think it would resonate with first generation Beatle fans. So he writes.
Before you get started, sorry for me cutting you off there for a minute. Before you get started, first of all, I like to say you're teaching me a lot, and I'm sure the fans out there that are listening are learning a little bit themselves. You're very intelligent and know what you're talking about, and I'm sure learning a lot, and I'm sure they will learn a lot from you too. And before you read your little thing there, can you just go about and give me an example of your books and what they are called?
Of
Uh,
the
you,
cookbook.
yeah, your cookbooks. I'm sorry.
Yes, yes.
You have three of them. Is that correct?
I actually have four. I can't. You
Wow.
can't have a Beatles cookbook and not have a Rolling Stones cookbook.
Uh,
So
all right. I just wanted to get that across, and I'll put
yes,
something in the video for you for that.
yes, and you can find my books at laneastagg.com. I have the very first book. It's just called called Recipe Records, and it covers all kinds of music. You know, blues, country, music from the 50s to the 90s. And the Recipe Records, the 60s edition. It's only food and music of the 60s. And then I have the Beatles, a culinary tribute to the Beatles, Recipe Records series. And then the Rolling Stones, Let's Spin the Bite Together. So that's a tribute book for the Rolling Stones. I am currently working on Recipe Records, the 70s edition. So if I could ever quit my job, my day job, I might be able to write this book. But
all all right. I'm sorry for cutting you off earlier. I just wanted the fans to know your books and what we were talking about.
I really appreciate that, Lori.
Uh, no problem. And you can go on with what you were explaining before.
Oh, yes. I wanted to read the foreword that was written for my book, my Beatles cookbook, and it's from Andy Forgie, and he's a absolute masterful entertainer and musician. I think his website is andyforgie.com, ANDYFORGIE.com. And so he writes, 1964. As a boy growing up in Canada, my days were filled with dreams of one day playing hockey for my beloved Toronto Maple Leafs, watching Bonanza on our black and white television set, and just being a kid. In 1964, on February 9th, I had just turned 9. We burrow in for another cold and snowy winter. I shared a bedroom with my younger brother, a bedroom with the invisible line between his side and mine. This is where we would laugh, sometimes fight, and dream of doing great adventurous things. In 1964, on February 9th at 8 p.m., every household in North America, God, sorry.
That's all right.
Every household in North America is tuned into the Ed Sullivan Show to watch 4 young mop-haired boys from someplace called Liverpool, England. All I knew about England was that it was a far-off land of kings, queens, and knights of the Round Table. It might well have been Mars. The world was a very large place back then, but became one happy family when the cute ones started to sing, "Close your eyes and I'll kiss you." I, as did countless millions, went on a magical mystery tour over the next several years, from bubblegum trading cards, 45 RPMs, and miniskirts, through psychedelia and Eastern trance meditation, long hair, and even longer hair. All the while, the world around us revolved at a breathtaking pace. The Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, Make Love Not War, Woodstock, and Man Walking on the Moon. At each turn, it was those 4 young lads from Liverpool providing the universal soundtrack. The importance of the Beatles, musically, socially, and politically, has been and will continue to be analyzed and documented. However, it was the pure joy of that unforgettable evening during the winter of 1964 that I always return to. It is the same joy that you will find in every recipe of this fab new cookbook, created as only this could have been created, with love, love, love. I fondly recall conversations of John, Paul, George, and Ringo around our family dinner table, and that continues to this day. The Beatles and food go hand in hand. As one who loves his food, I always recognized the appetite that the Beatles had for things sweet and yummy, from cool cherry cream and nice apple tarts, coffee dessert and coconut fudge, fish and finger pies to marshmallows and marmalade, and of course, a nice cuppa. I was always curious what the King of Marigold was cooking in the kitchen while making breakfast for the Queen. Enjoy this book. Eat, drink, love, and laugh. That's what the lads would have wanted. So that is the foreword for the Beatles cookbook.
Awesome. Good job. Good job. That was just superb. And I have read a little bit of your book and I really like it. My wife has used it a couple of times so far. So your recipes are great. Great forward written for you there. And very nice. And with all that being said, Lena, I'm going to hand it off to the Bulldog. And I'm going to.
That was beautiful. I think that everybody that grew up in the 1960s ought to be required to read that. That was so beautiful. It made me feel like it's, just makes you feel like everything you've lived through and having wrinkles is worth it because you were there.
I agree.
It's pretty awesome. There's also a photograph of Andy when he was 9 years old with his brother in a little drum kit, and Andy's got on a Beatle wig and a Beatle guitar.
Wow.
Aww.
So we got Hey Jude and Penny Lena.
And there you
There you go. We thank you guys for coming on again and making another special show, because each time you're on, it's always a good one. But you got to tell us about your books and your different projects, what's coming up soon, what's coming out, of course, your podcast. Clue us in.
Okay, I think Jude needs to go because I already told about all of my books.
Well, I am the author of the John Lennon series. It is a proposed 9-volume series of which the first 4 books are already out. The first book covers John's life up to age 21, right before they were going to step onto the world stage. It ends when they have everyone in the band except for Ringo, but they know Ringo. They've been working with him closely in Hamburg, and Brian has just agreed to be their manager. In book 2, which is 1961 through 63, Ringo, of course, joins the band, and they take off. They record Love Me Do and Please Please Me, and then record their first album, and they are extremely popular all over the UK, but not yet in America. In book 3, She Loves You, they do come to America and take America by storm, and it's really the story of the outbreak of Beatlemania. Volume 4 is 1964, the year of Beatlemania, in which they do the world tour, the North American tour, A Hard Day's Night. John writes his first book and wins the Foyles Literary Award. And the book I'm working on now is 1965, and it's going to be called Shades of Life, because by 65, everything's starting to become a little bit drab instead of being exciting. As Lena just pointed out, you can't laugh at the same joke twice. The same experience can't be exciting twice, and they're doing it all over again. A world tour, a North American tour, a movie, a book, and it's becoming a shade. It's becoming boring. So I'm working steadily up to volume 9, which will take us up to 1980, December of 1980. They're written as narrative histories, but everything is documented and footnoted. Over 4,000 footnotes. You're getting exactly what John said, did, ate, wore, but you read it like a novel, which is a strange creation, I know.
And Lena, I know that you spoke earlier about your recipe books, but you also have another book. Is that correct?
Yes, I do actually. And the star of my book was making her presence known on the radio show earlier. It's called Little Dog in the Sun, and it is a children's book, and it's my true story of when my family wanted to adopt a puppy after the death of my best friend and co-author of my first Recipe Records cookbook. So it's a children's book, and it's also available at my website, laneastagg.com.
Oh, that is great. And thank you for that. And the reason why I brought that up is my wife had read that to my grandson, and I was listening as she was reading it. And it was an awesome book, I believe, and my grandkids enjoyed it very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And it's all yours, Bulldog.
And you can find the Lena's name is kind of unique, but you can find it on the show Lanea Stagg, so you can find her website. But I'm sure if you search it, it was a really cool book. I liked it very much myself, as well as her other books. But will you guys continue a tradition with us as we close out? Not because we're all great singers, but because of the positive vibe we try to send out. Can we all sing In the End?
Got it.
Everybody ready?
I'm with you, Bob.
All right. And in the end,
the love you take
is equal to the love you make.